Okay, hello, and we are doing our first collaboration video here today with Lloyd Evans. He is an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and Jehovah's Witnesses are a destructive cult in the same way that Scientology is, and I thought it would be a good idea to connect up with him and see, how things compare and contrast between the two destructive cults and what life is like in them, and how we both, what our different stories and how we got out and decided to be activists against them, and proceed from there and see what sort of things come up. So, hi, welcome, Lloyd.
Thank you for having me on the video, and thank you for taking the initiative with this.
Absolutely. Okay, good. Well, why don't we start with you briefly telling your story as a JW, how you got involved and how you eventually, twigged on something was wrong with it and got yourself out.
Okay, so I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness from childhood. I was baptized at the age of 11. It's not uncommon for witnesses to be baptized as young as 9. And from that point onwards, from being baptized, you're essentially locked into the cult. There's no graceful way of leaving. And when I was 20, I started to, see gaps in the matrix, so to speak, and realize that there were issues. But when I was 21, my mother died, and that forced all of those things onto the back burner, because when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're told that, well, yes, your mother is dead, but she's not quite dead. She's still alive in Jehovah's memory, and the way for you to see her again is to be a good, loyal Jehovah's Witness. So I bought into that and continued to advance in the organization to the point of being an elder. And then through a series of events, I ended up moving to Croatia when I was 29. And within a year, I had woken up, because I was no longer attending indoctrination meetings in English. I could no longer understand the local language. And as a result, I literally felt myself get unplugged from my indoctrination. And since then, I've been involved in activism.
Awesome. Awesome. That's fascinating. I have a question.
To compare your story, really, don't we, with your Scientology experience?
Well, it's the comparison. Actually, the direct comparison is more along the lines of, you went to a place where you couldn't be as deeply embedded or as deeply involved with it because of the language barrier, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And for me, that happened because I was traveling all over the United States for a couple of years, and so I was kind of unplugged from the central core of the Sea organization in Los Angeles, because I was literally in a car driving around and and meeting various people who were kind of disaffected with the church and trying to get them back in. That was my job, was go out and get them back in.
Sorry, I don't know too much about your background. Were you in the Sea Org?
Oh, yes, I was.
Right.
Yeah, I was in the Sea Org for 17 years.
Right.
And it was when I was, the last 4 years of that was spent traveling around the United States, working on different projects and opening up different churches. They have this ideal org program where they're opening up nice big buildings.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was working on that, and in the process of doing that, I saw things that most cult members don't see with their own two eyes, which was a lot of big empty buildings.
Yeah.
And I was curious, how do the JWs promote their success or their expansion within the JW community? Do they have big events where they announce lots of good news or anything like that? Because that's a real big deal in Scientology.
Sure. Well, events have been very much a part of the JW calendar for decades, but probably they're structured differently to Scientology. I mean, from what I can tell, you have these events that seem to be focused around buildings and opening up buildings, opening ceremonies. We don't really have that. We do have dedications of new buildings, and they can sometimes be quite big events, but they're not given anywhere near the same kind of Hollywood treatment that Scientology gives. The main events for Jehovah's Witnesses are the regular conventions that take place on a yearly basis for most witnesses. In between that, you've got kind of smaller assemblies, which are about 1,000 people, and then you have the larger conventions that are between 5,000 and 10,000 people. And then you also have versions of those conventions that are kind of designed for people to come from all over the world and kind of congregate, and they can be anything from 15 to 20,000 people. So you do have these big events, but they're not given, from what I can tell. Well, actually, let me go back. They haven't traditionally been given the same razzmatazz treatment that Scientology gives its opening ceremonies, but we are starting to see a great deal of hype surrounding the international conventions where governing body members are slated to appear. And there's a lot more hype surrounding them now. So you are starting to see people going crazy with handing out souvenirs and putting on special entertainment events for the convention delegates. So it's starting to go a little bit more like Scientology in that way.
Before Miscavige, David Miscavige, the current leader of Scientology, started the Ideal Organization program, which was around 2004. And since then, but all the way back to the 80s, he started this idea of international events where he would get thousands of Scientologists at a time to attend this big event, and he and other people, other Scientology luminaries, would go on stage and make these, you know, grandiose announcements about the expansion of Scientology and how great it was doing. And initially they were more fact-based. They showed actual facts and figures and had other people than Miscavige on the stage talking. And as the years progressed, it became, you know, it whittled down to just Miscavige standing on a stage.
Right.
And the facts and figures became more and more hype and less reality. You know, the graphs that they would show and things like that became ridiculous, ridiculously exaggerated. And and so, but I'm fascinated by what you just said, because you know, the JWs will have these events where you said you know, 15,000 people, 10,000 people at a time could show up at these. You know, the big, huge. It's funny to me because in Los Angeles, where I worked, the big unachievable target for every single event, the one we never even came close to hitting, well, except once at one event, was 10,000. If we could get 10,000 people, you know, it was on my
top of the Scientologists in the world, isn't it, or thereabouts?
Well, exactly, and it makes me wonder. You know, with your guys' events, it doesn't sound like it was that big of a deal to get that many people.
No, it's easy. They could do bigger ones if they wanted. And in fact, in the early years of Jehovah's Witnesses, there was like the heyday in the 1950s and 60s when they would literally cram, for example, the Yankee Stadium in New York with something like 250,000 witnesses, also tied in by audio link. So it's just purely the rules and regulations that stop them from doing that nowadays. But if they had the means to get, you know, those sorts of figures together again logistically, then they would do it. It's just purely the, you know, health and safety regulations and the capacities of these stadiums that's preventing them, because, you know, you have 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses around the world, so it's really no stretch for them to get those sorts of figures.
Wow. Well, that is itself a statement about the size of Scientology, because those events are a real barometer for how many members they really have. And if Scientologists claim to have tens of millions of members, then it should be easy to pack the Yankee Stadium. Yeah. And believe me, if they could, they would.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think all cults like the self-congratulation of seeing throngs of people all crowded together to sing the praises of the leaders. It's something that really buys into the ego of cult leaders, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's interesting. In fact, I wanted to ask you about that. I was watching some videos, you know, some of the critiques and things that you do, or the breakdowns that you do, where the JW leaders are talking. And it's funny, these guys are these old, you know, I don't know, I don't want to say curmudgeon-y, but they're not very sinister looking people, you know.
No.
And you know, David Miscavige in Scientology is kind of an intense man.
He's a Bond villain, isn't he? Really?
Yeah, he's he's quite something, you know, and he really spends a lot of money and time to put on this very flashy, showy image, and he's very Tom Cruise-like that way, you know. It's no surprise he and Tom Cruise are BFFs, you know.
Yeah.
But looking at the JW governing body, I guess these older men, it's quite different.
Yeah. Well, that's a good observation. I think there's a reason why it's different. In Scientology, there's only really ever been LRH and Miscavige. And you had this kind of very, how can I put it, rather aggressive takeover that was staged by Miscavige once LRH died. We kind of had that in 1916, quite a long about 100 years ago. We had that when the original founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taze Russell, died while he was on a train, and there was kind of like a leadership coup, and this strong authoritarian figure grabbed control of the organization. His name was Joseph Rutherford, and he was really our Miscavige. But we're talking, as I say, about 100 years ago that all that happened. The leaders of the organization that you see today have kind of arisen from an entirely different, how can I put it, evolutionary process. So that they're nothing like David Miscavige. What you look at when you look at the 7 governing body members that are currently in office, it's almost like the byproduct of like a microcosm of survival of the dumbest. So instead of it being a case of the smarter you are and the cleverer you are and the more aggressive you are, the more likely it will be that you'll be the leader. The way the leadership structure is set up with Jehovah's Witnesses is that the less independent thinking you have, the less education you have, the more you're willing to say yes, the more you're willing to follow orders, the more likely it will be that you will rise to the top. And as a result of that, when you look at the 7 men who are now the governing body members, you don't see a great deal of intelligence. They don't come across as being particularly intimidating. I can think of one example, but for the most part, you're right. They come across as rather beguiling and friendly, and you know, not too intimidating. But what you're really looking at is simple stupidity and senility, I would suggest. They really are the byproduct of an organization that quenches or pours water over any kind of free inquiry, any kind of criticism, and rewards people for just saying yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is really fascinating. It opens the door to a line of inquiry I'd like to kind of segue into for just a second that I didn't know I would be asking you about. But there is a lot of conjecture, I'm often asked about what will happen to, you know, who will succeed Miscavige. What will happen if Miscavige takes the money and runs, or dies, or simply, you know, one day says, okay, I'm done, and turns it over to somebody else, right? And it's always been my conjecture that when he goes, the whole thing collapses, because he's got the keys to the kingdom, and I don't think he's interested in sharing the passwords to the bank accounts with anybody else and that sort of thing. But it makes me wonder how, you know, you mentioned Rutherford was the JW Miscavige. Yeah. What happened with him that it evolved into what it is now? How did that succession occur?
Well, there was no real smooth transition. All you had was Rutherford dying, so he didn't really. I suppose you could say that he lined up Nathan Knorr to replace him, but it wasn't as though he was going to let Nathan Knorr replace him while he was still alive. It was very much over my dead body. So it literally took for Rutherford to die in his mansion in San Diego, which is another story entirely to highlight. I mean, he had a house built over in San Diego because he believed that this is where the likes of Moses, Abraham, King David, Samson would be resurrected in 1925 to start ruling over a perfect messianic kingdom on the earth. And he had his house in Beth Sarim deeded to all of these Bible characters. And the idea was that he would hold it in trust for them. And I've actually visited this house, so I know it exists. And I've got all of the old books that mention it, where they're very open about what the purpose of the house is. And it's a perfect example, without deviating from your question too much, of how when you really start looking in the organization's history, all the clues are there that it's a crazy cult. But no, it was inherited by Nathan Knorr when Rutherford died in 1942. And it was only when Nathan Knorr took over that we started to see the transition to the governing body format that we see today. Because in 1971, when Nathan Knorr was starting to get a little bit old and vulnerable and senile, he thought he'd share some of his power with an expanded group or governing body, with the idea being that he would still ultimately make all the decisions, but at least he had a little bit more delegation. And things kind of overtook him, so that while he was still president, the governing body said, no, if you want us to be a governing body, then we want to govern. And this entire entity kind of rose from the ashes and said, we are going to be the leadership moving forward. So it's quite fascinating. I'm writing about the whole thing at the moment in my book, and it has been covered by other writers as well. But it's very interesting to see the transition in Jehovah's Witnesses from a Miscavige LRH style setup where you have one leader to an organization where there is a group of leaders who consider themselves the same as Jesus's apostles.
That is absolutely fascinating, and there's no preordained any sort of path for Scientology, but it certainly does open up the idea that maybe that could occur for that organization, as scary as that might be as a thought, because I've always somewhat been comforted by the idea that once Miscavige is done, it's over.
You could end up with a whole raft of crazy leaders if Miscavige goes, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah, apparently that could be the case. It really is a matter of how the transition of the bank accounts and the lawyers who control so much behind the scenes in Scientology, how that transition occurs. If somebody else can step up and actually gain access to those things and gain control of them, and that's a pretty big logistical question when it comes to Scientology's labyrinth of corporations. But if somebody does manage to wrangle control of that, then it could carry on just in the same way that the JWs have.
Having said that, I can't help but feel when I look at Scientology that it's a dead man walking already.
Yes.
I think it's alive sort of in name only, and I don't see where the growth in Scientology is coming from. I just think the global exposure is, I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses are getting to the stage where, like Scientology, they have a toxic brand. They're not quite there yet. Mm-hmm. But even if we've kind of even if we hit the fast forward button and made it so that tomorrow Jehovah's Witnesses are as toxic as Scientology, you would still have a case where Jehovah's Witnesses have about 8 million members and Scientology has about 50,000 or less.
Right.
So we've got a lot of gas in the tank, or Jehovah's Witnesses have got a lot of gas in the tank in terms of how much they can survive off their members. But when you have a cult that is as toxic as Scientology with such a tiny membership core, it's only going in one direction, which is down. So I'm amazed. I'm amazed it's lasted this long after going clear, in fact. But yeah, it must be very encouraging for ex-Scientology activists at the moment, and which is partly why I'm trying to get a few of you to think about moving on to Jehovah's Witnesses after Scientology goes it's down, you know.
Well, to be totally honest with you, that is one reason why we're having this conversation today, because it's been my goal for a while now, a few months now, to expand what I'm talking about and what I'm doing, because I've realized that Scientology is but one of many destructive cults.
Yeah.
You know, and in fact, for my own recovery, it was a huge deal for me to hit on the fact that Scientology is nothing special.
No.
You know, and that L. Ron Hubbard was really just rolling out, you know, point by point, right out of the cult leader's playbook, you know, so to speak. And it was quite something, because in Scientology, and I'll ask about JW's here as well. You have an idea as a member of Scientology that you are part of something that is very unique, very special. No one else has this or anything else even approximating it, and so therefore, you know, you're in a special place. And to realize after the fact, you know, that Hubbard was no different than Jim Jones, Sun Myung Soo, you know, these guys, Moon, right, the Moonies, was doing the exact same things, the exact same indoctrination techniques, although, you know, albeit in Scientology, it's pretty, you know, methodized.
Yeah.
But to see those similarities was shocking to me, and to realize how ununique it was.
Yeah. And I think that is a key strategy in helping people who are inside cults, because one thing that I really try and do with my own activism is reach into my mindset from when I was still a Jehovah's Witness, and try and remember how I would have reacted to certain bits of information had I been shown them. And the trouble is, with most of the negative information about Jehovah's Witnesses that's available online, including on my website and on my YouTube channel, is that immediately, the moment a Jehovah's Witness sees something that is remotely critical, the barriers will go up. And it's like, no, I cannot listen to this. But the beauty of looking at other cults is that you're basically using a backdoor approach, because if there's one thing Jehovah's Witnesses are good at, it's criticizing every other religion.
Exactly.
There's a few books I can think of. One in particular, the Revelation book, which I was raised on, very, very fiercely critical of the Catholic Church, and in fact most Christian denominations that obviously weren't Jehovah's Witnesses. And when you use that strategy against them by showing a Jehovah's Witness, well, look at this documentary on the Mormons. Look at these BBC documentaries by Louis Theroux on the Westboro Baptist Church. Look at this fantastic documentary film by Alex Gibney called Going Clear. None of these films use the words Jehovah's Witnesses, but all of the same characteristics are there, so that you're watching them thinking, oh my word. And it's pressing all of the buttons without directly confronting Jehovah's Witnesses. So I think that this project and you reaching out to me and us hoping to kind of work together a bit better can only improve that and help people who are in different cults start to see the similarities.
I agree completely. I'm just finishing Steve Hassan's book, The Combating Cult Mind Control, and what we're talking about right now is very much a strategy to address somebody who's in a destructive cult, and start getting them to start connecting some dots by showing them other cults, things they would be willing to look at, that, you know, where exactly what you were just saying. They won't look at critical things about their own cult, but boy will they laugh at other cults.
It's on other cults, yeah.
Exactly. So that's a very valid strategy, and I can see in my own path how that you know played out for me. So let's get to you know, maybe some of the basics of how people get involved. I'm really curious about this. How do people get, other than being born into it, what sort of in Scientology they use the word dissemination. right? That's the word, spreading seeds, right? Disseminating is where that word comes from. For getting in new members, you disseminate to new members. They don't use the word proselytize, or
Right.
that word has nothing to do with Scientology, but disseminate does. How do JWs go about? Are they aggressive? Are they passive? How do they do it?
I think most people are familiar with the scenario of two Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on their door and having the magazines in their hand and a nice smiling face, and leading with some question like, wouldn't it be nice to see an end of suffering? Wouldn't it be nice to see an end of poverty? And that's the classic technique that Jehovah's Witnesses use, is door-to-door evangelism. The problem is that we're now in the internet age. So,
Right.
I mean, if you have salespeople coming to your door offering you a remarkable opportunity that seems too good to be true, if you've got any kind of common sense or intelligence, the first thing you do when the door closes is jump on Google and see whether it is too good to be true, because you can guarantee that there will be something that comes up straight away if there's anything negative to it. And that's what people are doing with Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's why the door-to-door technique of gaining new members is already kind of obsolete and not working. They've tried diversifying a little bit with using literature carts in city centres, and that's quite a big thing now. When you go into a city centre and walk around for any length of time, you'll usually find somewhere Jehovah's Witnesses with carts full of literature, trying to encourage people to have new Bible studies. But that suffers from exactly the same problem. As soon as people go home and go on Google, they'll again have the same information thrown at them. The only effective way to make a Jehovah's Witness nowadays is child indoctrination. And that's where you really do see some of the most potent propaganda. There's a series of cartoons on jw.org for children called Become Jehovah's Friend. And it centers around a fictional boy and girl called Caleb and Sophia and their JW parents. And the cartoons are all designed to teach children to be good, loyal Jehovah's Witnesses, and to be scared of dying at Armageddon if they don't pay attention at the meetings, and to be scared of growing old and wrinkly like Adam and Eve if they play with the wrong kind of toy. So very, very sinister, very, very potent propaganda aimed at children.
Wow, that's fascinating, and again, not dissimilar to Scientology, because the internet has been referred to as Scientology's Vietnam.
Yeah,
because there's no coming back from the toxic label that they have. Yeah. Who creates those cartoons and that? Who writes that stuff and does that? Is that all in-house, or?
Well, I think when the cartoons first appeared, there was some conjecture as to whether they'd hired an outside firm, and I think there's definitely been some outside expertise, because the cartoons are done to quite a high standard. But I think ultimately it's done in-house, and all of the voices and the scripts and everything comes from the Watchtower headquarters, so it's very much an in-house job now.
Okay, cool. I'm just kind of grinning at the background activity.
Yeah, sorry, I'm in someone else's house, so I'm letting them kind of come and go. Hopefully it's not too distracting.
No, it's fine. It's totally fine. How much exact methodology or preciseness of the techniques and what that they use? In Scientology, there's a lot of policy letters and bulletins that Hubbard wrote, just books and books and books of these things about how to do everything from washing windows to properly disseminating to doing the counseling, and it's all very precise. How much of that is there beyond the scriptural texts of the Bible and whatnot? Are there very many policies or procedures for doing these kinds of things in the JWs?
Yeah, you name it, there's a policy for it. A similar thing, really. I don't know whether you're familiar with what's happening in Australia at the moment, but there's a royal commission into institutional responses to child abuse that's going on, and Jehovah's Witnesses are really under the spotlight there because of their terrible track record in mishandling, child abuse. And one thing that the Commission are doing is they're going into the policy documents of Jehovah's Witnesses, all of the memos, all of the letters, all of the guidelines. There are books that only elders are allowed to, or sorry, there's one book that only elders are allowed to read. Normal witnesses don't get to see it. And in fairness to the Commission, they're doing a very skillful job of bringing up all of this information and challenging the Watchtower leaders in Australia on it. But I can remember when I was an elder for only a brief period, only a year, but on a almost weekly basis, we'd get letters passed down from headquarters on even the most menial things, you know, how to run the parking lot, how to empty the donations boxes, who should hold the microphones at meetings, who qualifies to read the Watchtower at the Watchtower study. Really the most menial things all had rules for them.
That's fascinating. That's actually very interesting because it's completely parallel with Scientology. And another thing that's parallel is actually this Royal Commission. I don't know if you know, in the 60s, I think it was, there was a Royal Commission in Australia,
right,
investigating Scientology, and it ended up with, for a brief period of time, there was a ban on Scientology in Australia as a result of that.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know
that. Yeah, it was quite something. The old Australian Scientologists would tell war stories about how they were defying the Australian Commission's, findings and whatnot back in the day, and they had their Scientology materials buried in the backyard, and would run meetings out of their living rooms and things like this because there couldn't be official organizations. It was all very, presented in a very heroic light, against the suppression of the Australian government.
That's right. Well, that's one thing that cults absolutely love, is to be persecuted and to feel persecuted. And that's one of the reasons why I don't advocate for Jehovah's Witnesses to be banned. I genuinely believe that everyone should have the choice to join whatever wacky cult they want to choose. But by the same token, I think cults have responsibilities to society, especially if they're going to claim tax breaks and, in some cases, charitable status. I think it should work both ways. So it particularly insults me that in the United Kingdom, Jehovah's Witnesses are registered as a charity, even though they print propaganda telling my sister and my dad that I should be shunned as a mentally diseased person. Apparently, it's okay for a charity to do this. So there's clearly issues there that need to be looked at. And there are responsibilities that all organizations should have, whether they're religious or not. But ultimately, I don't think the answer lies in banning, because all you do is you make it more exciting and romantic, and you feed into the whole persecution complex that cults already have.
Exactly, I agree completely. That underdog sort of image that a cult can then foster with non-cult members, they'll garner a lot of support on that, and that's definitely not a winning strategy. To I think I agree completely with you. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and encouraging people to think for themselves is really what gets people out of cults.
Ultimately, I think it's Stephen Hassan who's put it quite well when he said nobody likes being lied to. Ultimately, no one likes being lied to. So provided all of the information's out there, and provided these organizations themselves are being forced to play by the rules, which at the moment they're not, you can more or less leave it to people to figure it out for themselves. But at the moment, you have this very uneven situation where organizations like Scientology, like Jehovah's Witnesses, like a good number of other cults, are getting away with murder in terms of tax breaks and official status and charitable status. And it's only through the efforts of people like you and I that that awareness is gradually being raised about it, so that governments can start to think, oh, actually, we do have responsibilities here. We do need to look into this.
Exactly. Well, okay, so so now in terms of indoctrination, you have people who are raised in the JWs, but then you also have people who have been proselytized to. They come in, let's say I were to want to convert to Jehovah's Witnesses, right? How is a fanatical frame of mind created in the JWs?
Well, same as with any cult, deception. If there was one word I could use to boil down the whole idea of mind control and undue influence and brainwashing, whatever you want to call it, I would shrink it down to deception. You can get people to do pretty much anything that you want them to do, provided you're skillful enough at lying to them and withholding information. You see it with Scientology, you see it with Jehovah's Witnesses. If there's published information that's critical about the organization, guess what? It's wrong, and it's actually we, the cult leaders, who are right. All of that other stuff is some huge conspiracy to mislead people into doing bad things or saying bad things about us. It's actually us that are telling the truth. All of this is deception on some level, and it's inexcusable enough when it's done between adults, but when you have the situation where children are being lied to, I think that's one of the most distressing things for me, because I can see it happening with my own relatives who are becoming the next generation of Jehovah's Witnesses in my family. I can see them being deceived and lied to as well. But I think you can kind of excuse it to some extent when it's between adults, but child indoctrination for me is one of the most sickly forms in which cults do indoctrinate new people.
Agreed. I totally agree with you. I don't have a broad solution for this really figured out well yet, but I definitely consider that some of the mental and psychological anguish that children are put through in the name of religious beliefs is tantamount to child abuse.
Yeah.
I really don't have another word for it. I mean, especially when physical violence comes into it, where a child is beaten into believing something, or punished for not believing it, which is equating to the same thing.
Yeah.
I think that's child abuse, and I think it's wrong. And there's of course, in the States, there's freedom of speech and freedom of thought and that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of a how do you regulate this effectively, because you can't tell people what they can and can't believe, and you can't easily tell people too much about how to raise their kids in terms of inculcating belief. But so it's a tough question, but it seems kind of clear that it can become a form of abuse, and that's definitely unacceptable.
I think we're just at the wrong point in history at the moment. I think that future generations will figure out how to navigate these nuances of how do you keep religious liberty, and how do you give parents freedom to to teach their children without allowing for this situation where cults can so easily exploit the whole arrangement. I think future generations will have it all figured out much better. But it falls to us, unfortunately, to help lay the groundwork. And we are getting some really powerful chunks of information by people like Alex Gibney, by people like Lawrence Wright, who are just helping the broader public realize, listen, there are people who are exploiting the status quo, and they're getting clean away with it, and they're going to keep getting away with it until we do something about it. So there are things I think about from time to time. I think that it would be nice if school children could have a compulsory lesson in their syllabus where they're told about mind control and undue influence, and they have at least this idea given to them that not everything that their parents or friends or community leaders tell them is necessarily going to be true. It's always important to question things. It's always important to do research. And when you think you have all the answers, that's probably the point where you're on the where it's most urgent that you do research. So there are things that we can do. There are things that I'm sure future generations will do. But I think it's exciting to be, in a way, to be part of the kind of, to be among the pioneers in trying to raise awareness in this area.
Yeah, I agree. It's fun to do this, you know, from a certain point of view. It's certainly it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
To be on what we now consider to be the right side of things. You know, when you wake up from mind control, you know, there's certainly an urgent desire to want to do something about it.
Yeah.
And it's satisfying to fight back against that sort of thing. And I agree completely about what you're saying about teaching children about mind control, undue influence. I think also critical thinking skills, you know, it should be just mandatory in schools, you know, and it's a real omission that it's not in there. Even up to the college level here in the States. I'm not sure internationally, but here in the States, we were woefully inadequate in teaching our kids about that.
Yeah.
How are violations of all of these rules and policies and whatnot in the JWs dealt with, you know, on a real like in a real practical manner? Are elders responsible for dishing out discipline, and how does that, you know, what can somebody expect as a Jehovah's Witness if they start going off the reservation or off the path? Not fully out, they haven't left, but they just start disagreeing with things and start manifesting those disagreements.
Well, there isn't really any room for disagreeing with things. And the worst you can have is a situation where a Jehovah's Witness has doubts. They could maybe be open about the fact with their witness friends and family, oh, well, I have doubts at the moment. But there's only so much mileage in that in terms of staying afloat in the congregation. At some point, you're going to get attention from the elders. And the solution that will be put to you is that, well, if you have doubts, really, you shouldn't be entertaining them. You should be doing research into only Watchtower publications. And if you still can't find the answers in those publications, then you should forget about them and stop talking about them. So that's the approach to doctrinal differences. There is no room for doctrinal differences among witnesses. But in terms of discipline, probably you're aware there's a great big long list of things that Jehovah's Witnesses simply aren't allowed to do. And a good number of those are what's termed disfellowshipping offences. So if you do one of those things and you're unrepentant for it, then you will be disfellowshipped. Now, the interesting thing is that some of these things are actually quite trivial compared to crimes. So, for example, you could have, you know, let's say an 18-year-old girl sleeping with her boyfriend. So that would be a disfellowshipping offence. Someone getting involved in professional boxing, that's a disfellowshipping offence. Someone smoking a cigarette, that's a disfellowshipping offence. So lots of reasonably trivial things are classed as disfellowshipping offences. But you could be a pedophile, you could rape a child, and if you say the right things and convince the elders that you're sorry, you won't be disfellowshipped. You know, you've committed a crime that will leave a long-standing scar on the poor child. But if you say the right things and you convince the elders that you're sorry, then you get to continue on as a Jehovah's Witness. And as we're finding out in the Australian Commission, in the majority of cases, these crimes go under the radar. So it really is remarkable the lack of fairness and the lack of justice when you actually really start to examine the disfellowshipping practice.
That's very interesting, and again, it brings to mind exact parallels in Scientology, where I know of well, two cases come to mind where the one was a guy who was a convicted pedophile, like he got caught, and went to jail, and within the Scientology world, they covered it up. covered it up to the point where nobody even knew the guy was in jail. Like, they kept up his Facebook page. You know,
Right.
they kept up an appearancy that he was, you know, was okay, and his wife went along with this. And at least that's the information that I have, right? It's shocking. And then this came out, you know, another activist, you know, did a news story on this, and it was like, what, huh? You know, I actually knew that this guy, you know, so it was quite shocking to find out he was a pedophile. And then again, Australia rears its head. There was a woman out there who was the president. She was Australian, and she was the president of the church's anti-psychiatry organization. It's called CCHR, the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. And she had encouraged a child to not testify or not you know, press charges or something in regards to being abused. And this came out years later, and she got ousted.
Right.
But within the Scientology world, you know, no real major consequences. It was all just a big, you know, in Scientology, non-Scientologists are called WOGs.
Right.
Right. So it was just a big WOG thing, you know, that WOG conspiracy, WOG justice was wrong, you know, in this case, because she was doing the right thing, sort of deal. So totally parallel. You know,
you would think that you would think they would be falling over themselves to get rid of these criminals, but for some reason, oh no, well, this will reflect badly on us, and we need to do our part to suppress the truth from coming to light. It's remarkable stuff.
That's exactly right. It's all about the PR, and it's interesting seeing that also in the JWs.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now, if a person is disfellowshipped, and you know, I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with this as I should be. Is that a step in the direction of being shunned, or is it like 0 to 100? I mean, you're nothing. You know, like everything's great, and then boom, you're shunned. Like how does that progression work?
Yeah, it's 0 to 100. And the ironic thing is that there used to be a strong anti-disfellowshipping sentiment in the organization. And again, we reach back into the history of the witnesses when it was very much a different religion. In 1947, not long after Rutherford died, there was an awake published about excommunication that was fiercely condemning the practice of excommunication and saying that it was being used as a weapon by the Catholic Church, that it was completely against Bible verses. That it was
really?
Oh, they were very, very strongly against it. But within only a few years, in 1952, there was a complete U-turn, and they decided, actually, it's not so bad after all, and in fact, we're going to start doing it ourselves. So they started disfellowshipping people in 1952 for, as I said, this list of wrongdoings. But even then, it was better than it was now, or than it is now, because in 1952, let's say you had a relative who was unfairly disfellowshipped for something, and you could see for yourself that the witnesses weren't anything special, they were just another religion, you needed to get out. There was a way for you to disassociate yourself as a witness, but still not be shunned. So in other words, you could kind of gracefully exit the organization and still maintain ties with those who were still in the organization. But then in 1981, or more to the point in 1980, there was a huge scandal involving apostasy right at the top of the organization, as a result of which one of the governing body members resigned and was later disfellowshipped. And amid that scandal came in the new rules that said, actually, disassociation we now view as just the same as disfellowshipping. So if someone wants to leave of their own free will, they can do, but we're going to punish them the same way as we would punish someone who'd sinned. So it became just as bad. And that was really when the doors closed and it became impossible to gracefully leave the organization. I would only have been about 2 years old at the time. But changes were made that I'm now living the consequences of. So, yeah.
Right. I do understand that.
Yeah.
The whole disconnection thing is horrific. In Scientology, there's a very definite progression. It very rarely goes 0 to 100, because I think a reason for that might be because it's so small,
right?
You know, and they don't want to give up members. They do a lot to try to you know, keep somebody in. Yet it's kind of funny because at the same time they're doing everything they can to drive the person out by treating them so badly, but in their own kind of way, you know, in the Scientology mindset, what they're doing is trying to handle the guy so that he gets his head on straight and wakes up and stops being so, you know, evil. And you know, and so they really drag it out in some cases, months or even years, where they'll have the guy doing a toning and, you know, and trying to make up for the damage that he caused and all this sort of stuff. And of course they
by giving money.
Yeah, oh yeah, they definitely are going to be given money.
Yeah.
And other things too. You know, they have to stand out on the street corners and pass out their way to happiness books, and, you know, and all that sort of thing. I'm curious. Is there a road back for somebody who's been, you know, shunned, disenfranchised?
Yeah, just it's very humiliating. If you've been disfellowshipped and you want to become a witness again, you need to attend months and months of meetings without people talking to you. So you literally need to go into the Kingdom Hall and sit at the back and spend meeting after meeting with people pretending you don't exist. So it's like immersing yourself in that environment where people have their backs to you and pretending they're not, you know, pretending that you're not there for months and months to establish the fact that you're repentant. Because the idea is that if you'll drag yourself through that kind of humiliation, then you must really, really want to come back. And then after a few months, if the elders believe that you're finally repentant for your sin, an announcement will be made, and hey presto, you're a Jehovah's Witness again. But I think that in many ways, the way that former witnesses are treated is kind of it's refreshingly counterproductive. So, for example, recently we had somebody who left the witnesses, and I'm quite proud to say he credits my videos as helping him, you know, at least part of that process to wake up. And he really, really believed that you know, the witness religion was right. He was pioneering in a congregation in Canada. He was having meetings with elders, and he was really, really wanting to progress within the organization, but purely by virtue of the way that his elders treated him and made him jump through hoops to have very, very basic standard privileges that they could easily have given to him. They made it unnecessarily difficult for him to stay as a witness. So they kind of did my work for me in a way by treating him in a needlessly draconian way. And I think that's an encouraging thing about cults, probably about Scientology too, is because they are so deluded and because they have bought into their own crap so thoroughly, it leads them to do things and make mistakes that are counterproductive. It's a little bit like in World War II, you got to a situation where the Allies no longer wanted to kill Hitler because he was making all the best decisions for them. So it's a little bit like that with cults as well, I think.
Exactly. When in my initial analysis of Scientology after I got out, I realized the best way for me to describe it is that you know, it's the seeds of its own destruction are in its very DNA.
Yeah.
And you know, the way people act in Scientology, the way the organization treats its members, is in it's in its very DNA to abuse them.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, another ex-friend of mine has said, you know, look, everybody leaves.
Yeah.
Everybody leaves. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
You know? And I'm of course very encouraged by that because I've observed that to be the case.
Yeah.
What sort of results, you know, you mentioned one guy there. What sort of other results have you found from your activism so far? And how long have you been doing this, by the way?
About 3 years. I set up my website Oh, hang on. I set up my website in 2011, so I've been at it since then. And then in 2013, I started making videos. So I'm still relatively new at the game, to be honest. But I run a website that surveys ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and current Jehovah's Witnesses and asks them a range of questions. And one of the questions on the very latest survey relates to, has this website helped you to wake up from your indoctrination? I forget the figure that have said yes so far, but it's into the hundreds, which I take a great deal of encouragement from. And I hear these stories. I can't answer all the emails I'm getting already from people, not necessarily thanking me personally, but expressing their appreciation for something I've written or that's helped them to kind of wake up. But there's, for example, there's one couple who's just started making YouTube videos, a young married couple, and I think this perfectly illustrates the fact that the internet age is so difficult for cults to operate in, because they describe the fact that only as recently as 2013 they were a believing young pioneer couple. So in other words, they were spending about 70 hours a week each doing preaching work for Jehovah's Witnesses, and they went away on holiday. And while they were on holiday, they were told by the local witnesses, oh, well, when you get back to Canada, because they also were from Canada. They're not all from Canada, by the way. When you get back to Canada, there's a really, really big story and you'll love to hear about it. So they were like, oh, that's interesting. And they were so intrigued to know what was happening that they thought, well, let's go on Google and see if we can find any information on it. And the story was that Jehovah's Witnesses had just brought out a new revision of their Bible, which I happened to be covering at the time. So my article on it was the first result that they saw. They clicked on it. And when they were reading my website, they didn't know immediately that I was an apostate, because I try and write my articles in such a way that you're not going to know straight away who's writing it and what their position is. And this same thing happened maybe 2 or 3 times later, where there was a big story that all Jehovah's Witnesses would know about, and they went on Google, and my website was one of the first ones that they saw. I think that really illustrates the fact that the game has just completely changed. It's impossible for cult leaders to lie to people as easily as it was, say, 20 years ago. It's just difficult now for them to do that. And Google really has changed everything.
I agree completely. The internet is a total game changer. And it's interesting how the cult policies and the whole methodology of how cults operate has changed as a result of the internet, because the whole point of destructive cults is information control. And that's the one thing that you can't really handle or control in the internet age. Yeah.
The funny thing is with Jehovah's Witnesses is their response has been to try and put out more information on the internet. And the problem that you have is that they're now thinking, well, what we really need is we need to show the governing body members themselves more. And that's actually the last thing they should be doing. Because when I was a Jehovah's Witness, I took great pride in not necessarily knowing who the governing body were. So I could say to people in other religions, well, you have the Pope, you have this leader, you have that leader. I don't know who my leaders are. I just know they're called the governing body. Well, now we have the governing body of the 21st century who are saying, well, we really need to show ourselves on camera more so that the brothers can see us, and see our smiling faces. And all they're doing, again, they're being counterproductive, which is the beautiful thing about cults. They don't know when they're shooting themselves in the foot. And they're showing Jehovah's Witnesses, these befuddled, senile characters with jewelry draping off their fingers and unable to string together a coherent sentence and having to read off the auto cue, looking completely unnatural and completely disconnected from what's happening. And it's the best thing I could have hoped for. So the only downside is that I now have to do these rebuttals every month to their videos, but it's like shooting fish in a barrel, because they will always say something outrageous. So
Exactly. It's the same parallels in Scientology. Exactly. Their press releases are awesomely bad. You know, just horrific footballs.
I went through a phase where I was kind of addicted to watching Scientology videos. You know these tours of like new ideal orgs in Zurich or wherever, and I used to love watching those videos just because of how over the top and outrageous the narration was. I just found it quite funny, you know.
Yes.
I've passed through that phase now, but you know, who knows?
Yeah, it's quite something. Even, and I got to tell you, even within the church, when you're in the church, you know, when you're within Scientology and you're watching those things, they're so over the top. They're so, you know, insane that even within, you know, they create their own doubters. They create their own problems because people watch those things and they're just like, oh my God, who are, you know?
You see these huge conference rooms and huge meeting rooms with all of these seats and all these tables and all these e-meters, and you're thinking, there's no way they're ever going to fill that room. They'll be lucky to get a couple of people in that room, you know.
Exactly. No, that's exactly the case. That you got it. And they are the world's fastest shrinking religion right now, you know, which is how I like to talk about them. Yeah. So, okay, well, let's wrap this up. What's next for you? Do you have any big plans on the horizon in terms of your activism that you can share, or, you know, what you're doing now?
Thank you for asking. I'm very excited about my book. I'm more than halfway through writing it. It basically tells my story, but it also kind of intersperses my story with information about the organization and its history. So I try and go backwards and forwards a little bit with explaining, you know, what it's like to be a Jehovah's Witness and basic details about the organization while telling it through the lens of my own experience. So I'm really hoping I'll be able to release that maybe next year. And in the meantime, it's just basically trying to keep my head above water with covering JW stories on my website and doing the YouTube channel. And there's a lot of work, but I wouldn't change it for anything because it's life affirming. It's very rewarding, and it's exciting to be a part of something which you feel is gaining momentum.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree completely. We're both relatively new at this. We've only been doing this for a couple of years, but it is exciting work, and it is. I love what you just said. It's very life affirming. Yeah.
You feel as though, you know, you're making your own little contribution to the universe and leaving it a slightly better place for people. So it's good stuff.
Exactly the case, and so much more satisfying and rewarding than what we used to do, which was supposed to be so much more life affirming and rewarding and satisfying, but really wasn't, you know. And now that we're doing this, it is. So it's a lot of fun.
It is, and you meet great people all the time. I'm meeting you now, and I'm sure that we'll have other projects together in the future. I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time on this. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun and very educational. And I actually really look forward to reading your book. So hurry up and get it done. All right. And good. We will talk again soon. Thank you very much for being here. Is Lloyd Evans, who again, his YouTube channel is under John Cedars. And you should definitely check it out. It is fascinating information about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the kind of goofy things that go on in that group, you know, what these destructive cults are actually all about. So check it out. And thank you very much for watching.